Imagine receiving a mysterious invitation to one of the most haunted mansions in the world. A house filled with doors that lead nowhere, stairs that end in emptiness, and secrets buried in the shadows. This is the Winchester Mansion, a place built to confuse the spirits of the souls lost to Winchester rifles. John Marlowe, a writer in search of answers, decides to accept this invitation. He has no idea that what awaits him within these ancient halls may be far more terrifying than any story he's ever written. Prepare yourself for a journey full of mystery, where every door may hide a deadly secret and every shadow conceals something that doesn't belong to this world. This is the beginning of John Marlowe's nightmare. The envelope, thick and heavy, had no return address. When it arrived in his mailbox that cloudy morning, the protagonist, John Marlowe, was intrigued. He was a freelance writer specializing in stories about old, haunted houses, and rarely received anything so formal. Upon tearing the wax seal and unfolding the paper, he found a handwritten letter in meticulous script. Dear Mr. Marlowe, I would like to invite you to spend a few days at the Winchester Mansion in San Jose, California, where you may freely explore its corridors and secrets. Few have the opportunity to experience the mysteries of this place up close. I trust your curiosity and talent will do justice to the story that has yet to be told. Sincerely, a Kingsley, curator of Winchester Mansion. John had heard of the Winchester Mystery House. The story of Sarah Winchester, heiress to the rifle fortune, was well known among historians and ghost hunters. She had built the mansion in a desperate effort to appease the spirits of those killed by the rifles her family had manufactured. The house was her obsession, an endless project that resulted in a bizarre labyrinth full of secret passages and stairs that led nowhere. Sarah believed that as long as she kept building, the spirits wouldn't find her. John was intrigued. It wasn't every day that he had the chance to visit a place with such a rich history. Although the letter was unusual, especially the lack of details about the sender, he decided this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. If it was what he expected, the Winchester Mansion could make for one of the most captivating chapters in his next book. 2 days later, John found himself driving down the road leading to the mansion. The sky was overcast, reflecting the melancholic mood of the place. He had already done his research, studying as much as he could about the house's history and the legends surrounding it. Some believed Sarah Winchester was insane, while others thought she was truly being haunted by something beyond comprehension. To John, the mystery was irresistible. When the mansion finally appeared in the distance, he had to take a deep breath. Even with years of experience visiting old houses, this one was different. The asymmetrical towers and windows that seemed randomly placed made him wonder how anyone could live there. Every part of the structure seemed out of place, as if the house had been assembled by someone who didn't understand the basic laws of architecture. As he parked and stepped out of the car, John was greeted by a middle-aged man, the same A. Kingsley, who welcomed him with a courteous smile. His appearance was impeccable, but his eyes carried an unease that John couldn't ignore. "Welcome, Mr. Marlowe," said Kingsley. "I believe you'll find plenty of interesting material here for your work. The mansion is yours for the duration of your stay. Feel free to explore every corner." John thanked him and, with a mix of excitement and apprehension, stepped inside the mansion. The scent of old wood and a faint aroma of dust hit him as soon as he crossed the door. Kingsley disappeared silently, leaving John alone with his thoughts. The main entrance, which from the outside appeared grand, led him into a long, narrow hallway, surrounded by doors and windows that followed no logical pattern. It was as if the house had been built with no plan at all. He took out his small notebook and began exploring. Every door he opened revealed a new mystery. Some led to endless corridors, others to small, oddly decorated rooms, and one, curiously, opened to a solid wall. He smiled, recognizing the mansion's fame for this kind of peculiarity. The feeling of being watched followed him with every step. Yet John remained skeptical. His mind knew that places like this tended to affect one's psyche, and he had been to many haunted locations before. This would be just another strange house, he thought. As he explored the lower floors, an unsettling sensation began to grow inside him. Every room he entered felt tighter than the last, and the silence around him was so profound that he could hear his own breathing echoing off the walls. But he had no idea what awaited him in the nights to come. The mansion felt larger inside than John had imagined. The high walls, adorned with intricate moldings, contrasted with the heavy, somber atmosphere that filled the space. John felt suffocated by the silence, but it didn't stop him from pressing on. His investigative spirit pushed him to keep exploring the mysteries that this house promised. Right after Kingsley's reception, he found himself in a large living room, covered with antique furniture that seemed to have been carefully preserved. Each piece felt more like a historical artifact than a functional object. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, its lights flickering dimly, as if the electricity there had grown tired. As he looked around, John noticed the strange layout of the rooms. Instead of logical architecture, the spaces seemed to connect without any apparent coherence. Hallways led to unexpected places. Stairs emerged in the middle of rooms, and more than once, he found himself standing before doors that led to nowhere. "It's stranger than I imagined," he murmured to himself, jotting down a quick note in his notebook. Over the years, he had learned not to be swayed by first impressions. Often, the weight of a place's history was enough to create a sense of unease. However, the Winchester Mansion seemed to operate on its own logic, defying the laws of architecture and, at times, sanity. Following a narrow hallway, John arrived at a dining room whose windows offered a clear view of the dark gardens outside. He paused for a moment, watching the trees sway in the wind. The sky was dark, and a sense of desolation hung over the landscape. Despite the vastness of the property, everything felt incredibly empty. It was as if, beyond the mansion, the entire world had been abandoned. Kingsley's voice echoed behind him, nearly making him jump. "If you need anything, I'll be in my quarters. I prefer not to interfere with your exploration, Mr. Marlowe. This house has a way of revealing its secrets when we least expect it." John turned quickly, still a bit startled by Kingsley's sudden appearance. "Right. Thank you. I don't intend to bother you much." Kingsley offered a hollow smile before disappearing once again, his footsteps echoing as he vanished down a narrow hallway. A chill ran down John's spine. Even with his experience in old places, something about this mansion left him more unsettled than usual. Kingsley's reserved demeanor and the oppressive silence of the walls reinforced the feeling that he was being watched by something invisible. Determined to focus on his work, John continued his exploration. He climbed one of the narrowest staircases he had ever seen, each step creaking under his weight. The hallway that followed seemed to stretch far longer than it should have, almost as if the house were elongating, distorting as he moved forward. He knew the mansion's strange architecture could provoke illusions, but the discomfort he felt was undeniable. John found himself on the second floor, where the rooms were smaller and more cramped. A faint cold breeze circulated through the halls, as if the windows were open, yet there was no sign of wind outside. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the dim light coming from old lamps wasn't enough to chase away the shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of the rooms. A wave of claustrophobia hit him as he opened a door and entered a room filled with old mirrors. They were dusty, and the surfaces reflected only a distorted image of himself. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement in the reflection of one of the mirrors, something or someone passing behind him. He turned sharply, but as expected, there was no one there. "Just my imagination," he muttered, trying to push the discomfort aside. But the mansion, as he would soon discover, had its own ways of playing with the minds of those who dared to explore its secrets. That night, the mansion felt even more silent. The wind outside had ceased, and the only sound filling the emptiness was the distant ticking of an old clock somewhere in the house. John, tired after a long day exploring the mansion, sat on the bed of the room that had been assigned to him. The furniture was old, with an ornate headboard and silk sheets that seemed to be centuries old. As he reviewed his notes, he felt a slight headache. The pressure the house exerted on him was subtle but constant. He tried to shake off the feeling and focus on his work, but soon he was interrupted by a low sound coming from the hallway outside. It was the sound of footsteps, light and methodical, echoing on the wooden floor. John hesitated for a moment, thinking it might be Kingsley, but it was late. Why would anyone be walking around the house at that hour? Rising, he opened the door to his room and looked down the empty hallway. The footsteps stopped. For a few moments, everything remained in absolute silence, except for his own breathing. John squinted, adjusting to the faint light coming from a distant lamp. Nothing. No shadow, no movement. He returned to his room, telling himself that the mansion, with its old structure, probably made these noises naturally. Old houses had a peculiar way of tricking the senses, he thought. But the idea didn't comfort him for long. He lay down on the bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he was overcome by the feeling that something was wrong. Eventually, in a brief moment of dozing off, a sudden noise jolted him fully awake, a sharp creaking sound, as if a door was slowly opening somewhere nearby. John quickly got up, feeling his heart race. He grabbed his flashlight and once again opened the door to his room. The hallway was darker than before, and something seemed different, though he couldn't quite place what it was. With the flashlight in front of him, John moved down the hallway, illuminating each door, every dark corner. When he reached the end of the corridor, he heard the creaking sound again, this time clearly behind him. He spun around quickly, only to see a door that had been closed now slightly ajar. It was one of the doors he remembered locking while exploring the house earlier. Cautiously, he approached, feeling the air around him grow colder. Placing his hand on the doorknob, he gently pushed it open. The room beyond was empty, but something about it was different. The air was heavier, and he felt a presence, something watching him. A chill ran down his spine. Perhaps it was just the influence of the house or his imagination, but there was something there. Something waiting. The next morning, John awoke with a lingering sense of unease, as if the heavy air from the previous night still clung to him. The memories of the sounds and the door that had opened on its own remained fresh in his mind, but he forced himself to treat them as mere coincidences. Perhaps the psychological effect of the mansion, notorious for confusing its visitors. Determined to uncover more secrets, John resumed his exploration through the hallways. Throughout the morning, he began to notice something curious. Many of the doors seemed to be in different places from where they had been the day before. He knew that the Winchester Mansion was famous for its absurd architectural configurations, but this felt like more than just a construction trick. Doors that should have led to certain rooms now opened into corridors or didn't open at all. It was as if the house was playing with him. During his walk, one door in particular caught his attention. It was different from the others, more worn, with marks that suggested it was rarely opened. John didn't remember seeing that door the previous day. Intrigued, he tried to turn the handle, but it was locked. His first instinct was to leave it alone. Perhaps it was just a storage room or an old space that Kingsley preferred to keep closed. However, a nagging feeling began to build inside John. Something about that door seemed to be calling him. A chill ran through his body, but curiosity was stronger than apprehension. After wandering through the mansion for a while, John found a small room that appeared to serve as a storage for old objects. On a table, there was a set of keys. At first, he hesitated, thinking about how Kingsley might react if he found out that John was rummaging through the house beyond what was permitted. But upon looking again at the keyring, he noticed one larger, older-looking key that seemed to match the mysterious door. Back in the hallway, he inserted the key into the lock, and with a slight turn, the door finally opened. The creak of the aged wood echoed through the silence of the corridor, making John's heart race. On the other side was a small room, completely covered in dust, as if no one had entered for years. The window was coated with grime, allowing only a thin beam of light to pierce the room. In the center of the room, an old rocking chair faced the window. On the table beside it were a few yellowed papers scattered about, along with a small wooden box. As John approached the table, he felt a familiar presence, as though someone was in the room, watching him closely. When he looked at the rocking chair, he could have sworn it moved slightly, as if it had been used recently. Feeling his heart pound, John quickly grabbed the wooden box and the papers. He wasn't sure what was inside, but he was certain that whatever it was, it held something important, something the mansion had been trying to hide. That night, the unease that had already tormented John intensified. After discovering the mysterious room and the wooden box, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. The house felt more alive than ever. Sitting on the bed, he stared at the box in his hands, uncertain whether he should open it. The papers he found beside it were filled with confusing notes, apparently written by Sarah Winchester. But what disturbed him most were the repeated phrases, "They are watching me," the voices, "They don't stop." John began to feel a slight ringing in his ears, a growing pressure that made him squirm. It was as if the house was whispering, just on the edge of his perception. He tried to focus, but his thoughts blurred with the darkness surrounding him. The papers fell to the floor as he fixated on the box. What did it contain? Why was it hidden in that room? Exhaustion overtook him momentarily, and he lay down without opening the box. But sleep didn't bring relief. On the contrary, it brought a new form of unease. In the middle of the night, the whispers began. At first, they were just distant murmurs, so faint he could barely distinguish them from the sound of the wind outside. But soon, the whispers became clearer. Voices repeating words he couldn't understand, disconnected phrases blending into a disturbing chorus. John opened his eyes, and the darkness of the room enveloped him in an oppressive way. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He wasn't alone. The sensation was palpable. Something or someone was in the room with him. The air was cold, dense, as if the invisible presence surrounded him on all sides. John turned toward the door, expecting to see a shadow, but there was no one there. Then the sound came again, this time clearer. It was a woman's whisper, soft yet unsettling. And this time he understood. Leave. Panic started to creep in. He grabbed the flashlight beside the bed, pointing it into every corner of the room. The shadows cast on the walls seemed deeper, as if hiding something he couldn't see. But the whispers didn't stop. Now he could hear them all around, coming from every direction. Different voices, some deep, some high-pitched, all repeating the same word, leave. Breathing heavily, he stood up from the bed, still holding the flashlight. Something inside him urged him to follow the commands of those voices, to flee as quickly as possible. But before he could make a decision, a noise echoed through the hallway. It was the sound of the wooden box falling to the floor. John moved slowly toward the door of the room. His instincts told him that whatever was in the house, it was getting closer. And he knew, deep in his mind, that the voices weren't wrong. Something was trying to warn him. The sound of the wooden box hitting the floor echoed through the silent corridors of the mansion, sending John's heart racing. With the flashlight still firmly in his hand, he took a deep breath and forced himself out of the room. The hallway ahead was dark, except for the narrow beam of light his flashlight cast, creating shadows that seemed to shift as he moved forward. The whispers had ceased, but the silence that followed was just as unsettling. When he reached the end of the corridor, where the wooden box had fallen, John noticed that the lid was now open. Something inside glinted faintly under the flashlight's beam. He crouched down and carefully picked up the object, which appeared to be a small, antique key. His mind immediately returned to the mysterious door he had discovered the day before, the one that, strangely, wasn't on the mansion's map. With the key in hand and his heart pounding, he decided he had to uncover what else the house was hiding. He retraced his steps to the room where he had first found the box and headed straight for the locked door. The weight of the air around him seemed to increase with every step, as if the mansion itself was trying to stop him from continuing. He hesitated for a moment in front of the door, sensing a nearly tangible presence around him. Placing the key in the lock, he turned it slowly. A soft click reverberated through the silence, and the door creaked open. On the other side was a room unlike anything he had seen in the mansion. The space was small and windowless, dimly lit by candles that seemed to have been lit recently. The air was thick, charged with an eerie energy, as if time itself had been suspended within the room. At the center was a low table, covered with old papers, diagrams, and letters. On top of it was a large, faded sheet of paper showing what appeared to be the initial sketch of the mansion, scrawled by hand. But what caught John's attention was a small notebook, placed carefully in the center of the table. It was Sarah Winchester's personal diary. With trembling hands, he opened it and began to read. The first pages were filled with notes about the construction of the house, references to the constant modifications and the labyrinth she had created. However, as he flipped through the pages, Sarah's handwriting grew more frantic, almost incoherent, with descriptions of voices that tormented her day and night, and the constant presence of shadowy figures she claimed to see in the corridors. But then, something else caught John's eye. Near the end of the diary, Sarah wrote about a ritual. She believed that the spirits haunting her needed a passage, a portal, to keep them confined within the mansion. The renovations and modifications to the house weren't just to confuse the spirits, but to build a prison for them. And the secret room where John now stood seemed to be the epicenter of this unfinished ritual. As he leafed through the pages, one final entry from Sarah sent a chill down his spine. "They are still here. They never stop whispering, but I know what must be done. The ritual must be completed, or the house will never be free. And they will continue to hunt me." John closed the diary, feeling an even heavier weight on his shoulders. He now understood the real reason Sarah had kept building the mansion until her death. She wasn't just fleeing from the spirits. She was trying to trap them. But something had gone wrong. The ritual had never been completed. And now, decades later, he was in the same place, surrounded by the same forces that had tormented Sarah Winchester. With his mind spinning, John looked around the room. He felt the temperature drop abruptly, as though something had just entered the space. The sound of whispers returned, louder and more insistent this time. He knew, without a doubt, that the spirits were near, and that the key to their freedom, or his doom, was hidden somewhere in that very room. The whispers intensified as John stood frozen in the secret room, Sarah Winchester's diary still in his hands. The air around him seemed to solidify, making each breath harder to take. He could feel the presence of the spirits all around him, unseen but undeniably there. The room pulsed with a crushing energy, more intense than anything John had ever experienced. His heart racing, he took a step back, his back hitting the cold wall. The candles in the room began to flicker, as if an invisible wind blew across them, despite the enclosed space. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and shift in unnatural ways, forming outlines that resembled human figures, distorted, disfigured, but unmistakably present. The voices, once just whispers, turned into clear and threatening words, spoken in languages John couldn't understand. They merged into a cacophony of sounds, invading his mind as he fought to keep control of his thoughts. A growing pressure built in his temples, as though the voices were trying to take over his mind. I can't lose control now," he said aloud, a desperate attempt to anchor himself in reality. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something to help him make sense of what was happening. Then, he noticed the circle of symbols etched into the floor beneath the table. It was a complex pattern, made of runes and markings that seemed to have been drawn by Sarah Winchester herself during her attempt to bind the spirits. The ritual, Sarah's last hope, and now, John's only chance. He understood now that the mansion was more than just a house. It was a prison, a barrier meant to confine the entities that had haunted Sarah her entire life. But the ritual had never been completed. Perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because she had been interrupted, Sarah had left the task unfinished, and the spirits had remained loose within the house, ready to torment anyone who ventured too close to their secrets. With a growing sense of urgency, John knelt beside the circle of symbols. He had no knowledge of rituals or magic, but the instructions were in the final pages of Sarah's diary. Her frenzied handwriting pulsed in John's mind, echoing along with the whispers surrounding him. He began following the instructions, tracing the outlines of the runes with his finger, murmuring the words Sarah had written, even though he had no idea what they meant. The candlelight dimmed further, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the faint outlines of the figures on the walls, which seemed to inch closer. As he muttered the words, John felt a shift in the air. The voices of the spirits grew sharper, as if they realized what he was trying to do, and they didn't like it. The floor beneath him began to tremble slightly, and the shadows around him moved more aggressively, almost as though they were trying to break through the protective circle he had reactivated. Suddenly, one of the candles blew out. In an instant, the room's temperature plummeted, and a more defined figure emerged from the shadows, tall, vaguely human in shape, but its features were indistinguishable. John could feel the hatred emanating from it, a rage that had built up for decades, maybe even centuries. He knew he was now face to face with one of the spirits Sarah Winchester had tried to imprison. The figure advanced slowly toward him, and despite the paralyzing fear he felt, John continued to recite the words. The ritual had to be completed, or he knew he would be consumed by the forces surrounding him. The remaining candles flickered, and the spirit stopped at the edge of the circle, unable to cross the barrier. John felt a momentary wave of relief, but he knew the confrontation was far from over. The spirit began pounding against the invisible wall, and the walls of the mansion seemed to respond to its blows, trembling as though the entire house was alive and resisting what he was doing. Complete the ritual, finish what she started. Sarah's words echoed in his mind as the mansion seemed to close in around him. With trembling hands, John recited the final line of the ritual. A surge of energy swept through the room, causing the candles to flare up in a burst of light. The spirit screamed a high-pitched, terrifying sound before vanishing into the darkness, as if it had been sucked back into the very walls of the house. The trembling stopped. The shadows returned to their normal shapes, aligned with the contours of the room. Breathing heavily, John collapsed to his knees. The silence that now filled the room was deafening. The mansion seemed to have returned to its normal state, but he knew that something profound had shifted. The ritual was complete, but he couldn't shake the feeling. Was it truly over, or was there still something deeper that the mansion was hiding? John remained kneeling on the floor of the room, breathing heavily as he tried to regain his composure. The trembling had stopped, the shadows had calmed, and the overwhelming presence of the spirits seemed to have vanished. Yet, even with the ritual apparently complete, he felt no relief. The mansion was eerily quiet, as if it were waiting for his next move. His instinct screamed that he shouldn't stay any longer. Even with the ritual finished, John knew the house still carried a supernatural weight that was impossible to ignore. He stood up with effort, his muscles tense and aching. With his flashlight off, the room was engulfed in total darkness, but he could feel the mansion's invisible presence surrounding him, as though it was paying close attention to his every step. He quickly exited the secret room, shutting the door behind him as if that could somehow keep whatever lingering malevolent force remained inside. The hallway ahead seemed even longer than before, and the air was thick, almost suffocating. The walls creaked softly, as though the house itself was alive, but now they were only the echoes of an old mansion, no longer the shadows and whispers that had tormented him earlier. As he descended the stairs, his mind focused on one thing: getting out of the mansion as quickly as possible. He quickened his pace, passing through the hallways without daring to look to either side. All he wanted was to see the front door and leave behind the nightmare the Winchester Mansion had become. At last, the main door appeared in front of him. He reached out, half expecting something to prevent him from opening it. Perhaps the heavy air that had seemed to keep him trapped, or one last echo of the spirits that inhabited the house. But, to his surprise, the door opened without resistance, and he was met with the cool, damp air of the night. John stepped onto the porch feeling the weight of the mansion lift from his shoulders as he moved further away. The wind blew gently, and the stars were obscured by clouds. Turning back to look at the house, he noticed the windows were all dark, like eyes watching him in silence. There was something unsettling in that moment of stillness, as though the house was allowing him to leave, but not without a final reminder of the power it held. He descended the steps and approached the car, his hands still trembling. As he opened the door and sat in the driver's seat, he finally exhaled a deep sigh, his heart still pounding. Looking into the rearview mirror, John saw the mansion standing tall against the night sky. But even in the safety of the car, he knew he wasn't free. Something had followed him, a feeling that the spirits, though contained, hadn't completely disappeared. The mansion had marked him in some way, and he couldn't shake the sense that he hadn't truly escaped the nightmare that had unfolded within its walls. With his hands still shaking, he started the car and drove away from the mansion. But the feeling of being watched lingered as he disappeared into the darkness of the night. In the days following his escape from the Winchester Mansion, John tried to return to his normal routine, but normalcy seemed further out of reach with each passing day. He had retreated to his home in the countryside, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, believing that the silence and isolation would help him recover. However, ever since he had left the mansion, something inside him had changed. The feeling of being watched hadn't disappeared, nor had the strange whispers that sometimes echoed in his mind, like a memory he couldn't erase. The day began like any other, John reviewing his notes, trying to process the events and decide whether to include the experience in his next book. But something felt wrong with everything he did. A constant sense of discomfort followed him, like a shadow he couldn't see but knew was there. It was as if the mansion's presence still hung over him, even though he was miles away. One night, while reviewing Sarah Winchester's diary once more, John heard a faint rustling sound in the room next door. He froze, his heart pounding. He had convinced himself that the events at the mansion were behind him, but now, in the silence of his home, he began to doubt. Slowly he stood, his eyes fixed on the living room door. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like light footsteps crossing the wooden floor. He grabbed his flashlight, a reflexive gesture that reminded him of those long nights in the Winchester house. Shining it down the hallway, he saw nothing, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Each step he took toward the room made the air feel heavier, colder. When he reached the door, he hesitated. Whatever was in that room didn't belong in his home. He knew it. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open and turned on the light. Nothing. The room was empty, exactly as he had left it. He felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the lingering trauma from his experience at the mansion. Maybe he was truly free, and his paranoia was just a reflection of the horrors he had witnessed. But as he turned to leave the room, his eyes caught something that made his blood run cold. In the mirror beside the door, a dark figure passed briefly in his peripheral vision. John spun around quickly, but once again, there was nothing there. The mirror, however, seemed different, like something had moved through it, something that shouldn't have been there. The fear returned with full force, and he knew in that instant that the spirits of the Winchester Mansion weren't confined to the house. Somehow they had followed him, or worse, he had brought them with him. Trying to keep calm, he turned off the lights and returned to his bedroom. But deep in his mind, he knew he would never truly be alone again. A few weeks after his escape from the Winchester Mansion, John received an unexpected email. The sender was a haunted house researcher, someone John had briefly met at a conference years ago. The email was short, direct, and made John's stomach turn as he read it. Mr. Marlowe, I heard about your recent visit to the Winchester Mansion. I'm planning an investigation of my own and would appreciate it if you could share your experience with me. I've been told that unusual things continue to happen there, perhaps something only you might understand. John froze in front of the screen. The words "unusual things continue to happen" echoed in his mind. Even far from the mansion, he couldn't escape the sensations that haunted him daily. The footsteps he heard at night, the strange reflections in mirrors, and, above all, the constant feeling that he was not alone. Something had followed him, something he would never fully understand. He began typing a response, but stopped his hands over the keyboard. What could he say? That he had unleashed something at the mansion? That despite Sarah Winchester's ritual, the spirits still roamed, perhaps stronger than ever? The words he wanted to write felt dangerous, as if acknowledging them could make the situation worse. In the end, he deleted the response, closed the laptop, and looked at the mirror across the room. The dark figure he had seen days earlier seemed to be lurking, waiting patiently. He knew his nightmare wasn't over, and maybe it never would be.